The sun, the great Ra, dips below the horizon, painting the western sky a magnificent blood orange. Within the silent gilded halls of the palace, the air crackles with an electric, almost unbearable anticipation. Every courtier, every priest, every servant holds their breath. Today, the world shifted on its axis. The old king, the embodiment of Horus on earth, has finally departed to join his divine ancestors. A new king has been named. He stands on the precipice of his destiny, about to experience a profound transformation. The question, a tantalizing whisper in the corridors of time, is this: what happens on the Pharaoh's first night? The very phrase conjures a tapestry woven with threads of modern romance and mystique. We envision a lavish, intimate ceremony, a celebration of a union between two souls, culminating in a night of quiet, personal joy and shared destiny. We project our own cultural narrative onto the ancient world. But here in the heart of ancient Egypt, in the sprawling palace of a man who commands the Nile and the desert, such a concept is a beautiful, though profoundly inaccurate, dream. The first night, as we understand it, a culmination of romantic love and marital vows, simply did not exist for a pharaoh. His life was not his own. It was a cosmic duty. His identity was not personal, but divine. And for him there were not one but two first nights, each with a purpose far more consequential than private romance. The first was a night of cosmic renewal, a terrifying and awe-inspiring ascent from mortal to God. The second was a night of political alliance, a legal and social contract to secure the future of the two lands. One was a moment of terrifying, profound solitude, the other a public performance of dynastic duty. To truly understand the Pharaoh's world, we must set aside our modern lens and peer into the rituals that truly defined his life. The first and by far most significant was the first night of his reign, the moment he was crowned. But this was not a simple, single event. It was the beginning of a process, a sacred, multi-stage ritual that would fundamentally remake his very being. The death of the previous pharaoh, a moment of profound cosmic upheaval, plunged the world into a state of ma'at, or chaos. Without a divine ruler on the throne, the universe itself was unbalanced. The sun might not rise, the Nile might not flood. The very stars might fall from the sky. The priests, the viziers, and the highest officials of the land did not mourn for long. They had a singular, terrifying responsibility to ensure the divine transition. The new pharaoh could not celebrate his new station. He had to assume it immediately and with the full weight of the cosmos on his shoulders. He was not a husband to a wife. He was a husband to all of Egypt. And so, as the body of his father was prepared for its final eternal journey, the young king was sequestered in the innermost sanctuary of the palace. He was cleansed, anointed, and dressed in the sacred linens that had been passed down through generations. He was surrounded not by revelers, but by priests chanting the ancient words of the pyramid texts, their voices a low, rhythmic hum in the otherwise silent room. His first night as king was not a night of rest or celebration. It was a night of profound transformation. The air, heavy with the scent of incense and sacred oils, seemed to vibrate with the presence of unseen gods. The young man who, only yesterday, was a prince, a son, a brother, felt the weight of countless centuries pressing down on him. He was no longer just himself. He was the embodiment of Horus, the divine falcon, who had ruled over Egypt since the beginning of time. He was the inheritor of the Ka, the divine life force that had guided every pharaoh before him. This was a night of solitude and spiritual communion, a moment when the mortal shell was filled with an immortal essence. This was his first night, not of a marriage, but of a sacred, terrifying solitude. It was the night he became the living bridge between heaven and earth. His private anxieties, his personal relationships, his very humanity were burned away by the sacred flame of his new divine purpose. The man, a mere vessel, knelt before the gods. The Pharaoh, the divine son of Ra, rose to meet his destiny. The priests would later record the events not as a coronation, but as an act of heirship, where the new king officially took on the mantle of his divine ancestors. The second first night was that of the royal marriage, an event far less celebrated in public lore, but equally important for the stability of the kingdom. While the coronation was a sacred, one-of-a-kind event, the royal marriage was a legal contract, a practical arrangement. A pharaoh, particularly in the later dynasties, could have multiple wives, each with a different purpose. There was the great royal wife, the principal queen, who would likely bear the next king. There were secondary wives, often princesses from foreign lands, married for political alliances. And there were countless concubines who populated the harem and served various dynastic and diplomatic purposes. The royal marriage was not a sacred rite sanctioned by the gods as the coronation was. There were no grand ceremonies for a pharaoh marrying a local Egyptian princess. The event was a simple legal agreement, a joining of households, and was often done with little fanfare. Why? Because the pharaoh was already married to Egypt. His primary devotion, his life's work, was the balance and stability of his kingdom. A marriage was simply a means to an end, the continuation of his divine lineage. The first night with his new wife, whether she was a local noblewoman or a foreign princess, was not a grand celebration of love, but a moment of dynastic duty. The very nature of the event was transactional, designed to produce an heir and strengthen the ties that bound the nation together. For a foreign princess, the situation was slightly different. We know from diplomatic letters and artifacts that these unions sometimes involved a more elaborate procession and public declaration. The princess, a daughter of a king in Babylon, or Mitanni, would arrive in Egypt with a vast retinue and a dowry of gold lapis lazuli and exotic goods. She would be greeted with public acclaim as her marriage represented a powerful new alliance. But even these unions were rooted in political pragmatism. There was no romance, only power. Consider the story of a young pharaoh, newly anointed as he prepares to meet his new wife. He has just spent a year enduring the intense, body-shaking rituals of his coronation. He has been purified, anointed, and declared a living god. He has paraded through the streets of Memphis, the white walls of the city, shimmering under the scorching sun, and has been hailed as the embodiment of Horus. He is now, in every sense, more than a man. He is a divine entity. And now he must meet a woman who, in many ways, is simply a part of his new divine responsibilities. His marriage to her is not a joining of equals. It is a concession to a legal and social necessity. His true love, his true devotion, is to his land, his people, and the divine order he is charged to maintain. So when we ask about the first night of a pharaoh, we must rephrase the question. We are not asking about a moment of private intimacy. We are asking about the genesis of a god-king. We are asking about the sacred contract that bound a man to his country, his people, and the very cosmos. The first was the moment a man became a god. The second was the moment a god-king secured his dynasty. The first was a night of terrifying, profound solitude. The second was a legal and social contract, a joining of households. And to truly understand the pharaoh's life, we must first understand this fundamental reframing of our query. From this point forward, we will delve into the rituals of both the coronation and the royal marriage and witness how a man became a god and how a god secured the future of the world's most powerful civilization. The chamber was a tomb of silence, broken only by the rhythmic, low-pitched chanting of the priests. Khepri, the young pharaoh, stood motionless on the cool alabaster floor, the scents of myrrh and frankincense thick in the air. Only hours before he was a prince, a mortal man grieving the loss of his father. Now he was a king, but not yet a god. The transformation, the great terrifying ascent, had just begun. This was the true first night of his reign, a night not of rest or celebration, but of profound spiritual terror and rebirth. The priests, their heads shaved and bodies cleansed, moved around him like silent shadows. They were the intermediaries, the conduits, through which the divine would flow. He was not yet worthy to touch the sacred symbols of his office. First, he had to be purged of his mortality. The lead priest, an ancient man with eyes that seemed to hold the weight of all the pharaohs before him, approached with a golden bowl. He poured cool scented water over Khepri's head, and hands the liquid a physical representation of the purification rituals. This was not mere washing. It was the cleansing of a soul, stripping away the personal sins and imperfections of the man to make room for the divine essence. As the waters streamed down, the chants grew louder, a chorus of invocation. They were not singing to him, but for him. They were calling upon the gods, calling upon the very life force of Egypt to descend and fill this empty vessel. A sense of unreality settled over Khepri. He felt a profound sense of detachment from his own body, as if he were watching the ritual from a great distance. The familiar weight of his princely clothes was gone, replaced by the soft new linen of the ritual kilt, still pristine and unstained by the world. The priest then began the anointing, rubbing sacred oils into his skin. The oil was cool at first, then warmed, and Khepri felt a tingling sensation, as if his very molecules were rearranging themselves. This was the moment. This was the point of no return. The central mystery of the coronation was the transference of the royal Ka. In ancient Egyptian belief, the Ka was a person's spiritual double, or life force, created at birth and residing in the body. It was what gave a person their identity, their character. But the pharaoh's Ka was different. It was not his own. It was a divine, immortal essence passed down from the very first pharaoh, the god Horus himself. This Ka was the life force of the kingship of Egypt. It was what made a pharaoh divine. Without it, he was just a man with a crown on his head. The ritual, lasting a full day and a night, was a long, painstaking process of aligning his mortal self with this ancient spiritual energy. The priest now held up the sacred symbols, the Waz scepter representing power, and the Ankh representing life. Khepri was not to touch them yet. They were held near him, their divine energy radiating out, enveloping him in an aura of power. The chants rose to a crescendo, a single powerful word repeated over and over, Ka. As they spoke, Khepri felt a sudden sharp jolt, as if a lightning bolt had shot through his chest. His knees buckled, and for a moment he thought he would fall. But he remained upright, a strange new energy coursing through his veins. It felt like an expansion, a profound unclenching. The world which had seemed so large and terrifying, moments before now felt small and manageable. The weight of his father's legacy, which had pressed down on him, was now a part of him, an endless reserve of strength and wisdom. He was no longer Khepri, the son of the old pharaoh. He was the living Horus. The divine Ka had entered him. He felt the millions of souls of his subjects, their hopes and fears and sorrows as a single collective hum in his mind. He saw the Nile not as a river of water, but as the lifeblood of his kingdom, a pulse of green and blue that beat in rhythm with his own heart. The desert, once a vast and empty space, now felt like a part of his very being, a dry, powerful energy that he could command. This was not a metaphorical transformation. For the ancient Egyptians, it was a physical, tangible reality. The man was gone, his identity sacrificed on the altar of his divine duty. A god-king stood in his place. He was not a king who was close to the gods. He was a god himself, the very embodiment of the cosmic order. Now came the dressing. This was not merely about putting on new clothes. It was about embodying the symbols of his new divine identity. First they placed the Neem's headdress upon his head, the striped linen, a symbol of the cobra and vulture goddesses of Upper and Lower Egypt. Then came the false beard, a golden, plaited symbol of divinity and eternity. He felt its weight, an ancient, familiar weight that all his ancestors had known. And then the moment he had been preparing for his entire life, the crowns. The priests brought forward the hedjet, the tall white crown of Upper Egypt. They placed it on his head, its smooth, heavy weight, a declaration of his rule over the southern kingdom. The chants changed, becoming a celebration of the white crown. Then came the deshret, the red crown of Lower Egypt, its flat, coiled shape, a symbol of his rule over the northern delta. When they placed it on his head, he felt a pull, a balancing force. And finally, the two crowns were brought together, forming the shent, the double crown. The moment it was placed upon him, Khepri's transformation was complete. He was the ruler of both the two lands, a living symbol of unity and divine order. The coronation, for all its sacred, mystical nature, was also a meticulously planned theatrical performance. From this day forward, Khepri's every action would be a ritual. His rising in the morning was the sun, god Ra's daily ascent. His judgments were the pronouncements of Horus. His very existence was a constant reaffirmation of Ma'at, the divine order. The year-long process was a way to slowly acclimate the kingdom to this new reality. The coronation ceremony itself was just the opening act. The procession through the streets of Memphis, the airship ritual, and the subsequent festivals were all designed to reinforce the belief that the man they had known was gone, and in his place was a living God. The priests, now reverent in his presence, knelt before him. They no longer addressed him as Khepri. They addressed him as Nisut-Biti, he of the sedge and the bee, the king of Upper and Lower Egypt. They called him the son of Ra, the lord of the two lands. The words, once just titles, now felt like a part of his own name. He had shed his old identity, his old name, and was now a vessel for something far older and greater than himself. He felt no fatigue, no hunger. His mortal needs had been replaced by a boundless, divine energy. As the first rays of the sun of his first full day as Pharaoh, began to filter through the chamber, Khepri rose. His movements were not those of a tired, grieving man. They were the slow, deliberate, powerful movements of a god. He walked toward the main doors of the palace where his people were waiting. He was ready to begin his reign. He had not slept. He had not celebrated. He had ascended. The mystical chamber, heavy with the scent of incense and the echo of sacred chants, was only the beginning. Khepri, now the living embodiment of Horus, had undergone the spiritual transformation. The man was gone, replaced by a god-king. But the ascent to divinity, a process of inner alchemy and sacred ritual, was a private affair. The public, his kingdom stretching thousands of miles from the fertile delta to the unforgiving deserts of the south, still saw a mortal prince. His divine right to rule was a belief that had to be cultivated, nurtured, and relentlessly reinforced. The year-long coronation process was this very mechanism, a masterful political campaign, a deliberate strategy to embed his authority and divine mandate into the very fabric of the nation. He emerged from the inner sanctuary into a world buzzing with anticipation. The priests and high officials who had witnessed his transformation knelt before him in profound reverence. But beyond the palace walls, in the sprawling marketplaces of Memphis and the distant temples of Thebes, news of the old king's death was still a rumor, a whisper carried on the wind. The kingdom was vast, and the journey of news was slow. This delay was a dangerous vacuum, a fertile ground for rebellion, power-hungry officials, or the rise of competing factions. The year-long coronation was designed to fill this vacuum, to physically and spiritually manifest his rule in every corner of the two lands. The first political act was a grand proclamation. Messengers were dispatched not by foot, but by the fastest chariots and boats to every temple, every city, every remote outpost. They carried not just a message, but a decree the son of the sun, God Khepri, had been crowned. His reign had begun. This was a critical first strike, an act of controlled information that solidified his legitimacy before any challenge could be mounted. The people were told with the full weight of the divine authority that the cosmic order had been restored. The new sun had risen. Following the initial proclamation, the true political campaign began the royal procession. It was not enough for the people to hear of their new king. They had to see him. In a world without photographs or broadcasts, the pharaoh's physical presence was his most powerful tool of propaganda. He embarked on a journey down the Nile, a majestic spectacle that turned the river into a sacred highway. His royal barge, a shimmering vessel of cedar and gold, was flanked by a fleet of smaller boats carrying his viziers, priests, and military commanders. This was no pleasure cruise. It was a moving display of power. As the procession moved from Memphis in the north to the sacred city of Thebes in the south, the riverbanks would swell with crowds. They lined the shores for miles, a sea of faces, to catch a glimpse of the man who held the universe in his hands. At each major city, Hermopolis, Abydos, and countless others, the procession would stop for days, even weeks. These stops were meticulously choreographed. The pharaoh would disembark dressed in his most magnificent regalia and lead a procession through the city. He would enter the local temple, make offerings to the city's patron god, and perform sacred rituals. This act served a dual purpose. It publicly demonstrated his piety and reverence for the local deities, thus gaining favor with the local priesthood and populace. And it visually cemented his role as the sole bridge between the gods and humanity. The processions were not just for show. They were for the distribution of patronage. At each stop, the pharaoh would grant new titles, distribute wealth, and confirm the land holdings of loyal governors and nobles. In a kingdom where power was based on loyalty, these acts of public generosity were critical. They ensured that those who held local power had a vested interest in the new king's reign. The officials who received a golden collar or a new plot of land were now bound to Khepri. The priests who were given new endowments for their temples would sing his praises from their pulpits, spreading the word of his divine righteousness. This created a network of obligation and loyalty that spanned the entire kingdom. The most potent political ritual of the entire year-long process was the unification of the two lands. This ceremony, a symbolic reenactment of the mythical unification of Upper and Lower Egypt by the first pharaoh, was a core part of the coronation. Khepri would be led through a ritual that symbolically joined the papyrus plant of the north with the lotus of the south. He would be crowned first with the white crown of Upper Egypt and then with the red crown of Lower Egypt, before finally donning the shent, the double crown. This ritual was a powerful piece of political theater. It served as a constant reminder that the pharaoh was the sole figure who could hold the nation together. He was the unifier, the protector against chaos. In a kingdom with such diverse regions, this ritual was a constant call for national unity under his divine rule. The year-long process was also a matter of economics and infrastructure. The pharaoh's reign was not truly solidified until the construction of his mortuary temple and eternal tomb began. This was a monumental undertaking, a project that could take decades and employ thousands of people. The beginning of construction was a highly visible sign of his long-term power and permanence. It provided work for artisans, laborers, and engineers, creating a vested economic interest in his reign. The new king was not just a symbol. He was a provider of stability and prosperity. By the end of the year, the whispers had been replaced by roars of approval. The remote villages and distant cities had seen their king. They had been told of his divinity, seen the signs of his favor, and participated in the festivals that celebrated his reign. The vast, sprawling kingdom had been brought under his full control, not by force of arms alone, but by a meticulously planned theatrical demonstration of his divine and political power. The man who had entered the chamber was now an unassailable god-king. The year-long coronation process had made it so. The sun-drenched road to Abydos was a pilgrimage in itself. Khepri's royal procession, a grand serpentine of chariots, soldiers, and priests, had left the bustling delta and now moved into the sacred heartland of the south. He was no longer just a king on a grand tour. He was a pilgrim tracing the footsteps of his earliest ancestors. Here in this sacred city lay the tombs of the very first pharaohs, the men who had forged the two separate lands of Upper and Lower Egypt into a single unified kingdom. It was here in the shadow of their dusty mastabas that Khepri felt the full crushing weight of history. His vizier, the ancient and wise Imhotep, walked beside his chariot, his face a web of wrinkles and wisdom. He carried a rolled-up papyrus, a detailed replica of a much older, more precious relic. "My lord," the vizier began, his voice a low, gravelly hum, "the rituals you have performed and those you are yet to perform are not new creations. They are echoes of a time before recorded memory. Their purpose was forged in the fire of our nation's birth." He unrolled the papyrus, revealing a meticulous drawing of a broken inscribed stone, a fragment of what was once a great chronicle. "This, my lord, is what remains of the Palermo stone," Imhotep said, pointing a gnarled finger at the rows of hieroglyphs and pictographs. "It is the record of our first kings, a chronicle from the very dawn of our civilization. It proves that the ceremonial ascent to your divine throne is older than the pyramids themselves." Khepri leaned closer, his eyes scanning the intricate carvings. He saw the names of long-dead kings, their reigns measured in years. But more importantly, he saw the records of their rituals. Here, in these dry, scholarly records, was the blueprint for his own life. The Palermo stone and other similar fragments, like the Cairo stone, was not a grand epic. It was a ledger, a simple, dispassionate accounting of the king's year. It listed the height of the Nile flood, a census of the cattle, and most crucially, the ceremonies the pharaoh performed. The early kings, Imhotep, continued his voice a narrative thread connecting Khepri to the deep past, did not have a vast bureaucracy to rule their newly unified lands. The north and south were like two reluctant brothers, their allegiance fragile. The king's primary task was to show to prove that they held dominion over both. The ceremonies were not just religious rites. They were the very tools of unification, a constant reinforcement of their power. He pointed to a specific carving on the papyrus, a figure of an early pharaoh running. "This, my lord, is the Sed festival, or Heb-Sed, Our records show that even the earliest kings celebrated this festival to renew their divine authority. The ritual running of the walls of Memphis, a ceremony you will perform, is a direct link to this ancient practice. It was a physical and symbolic act of mastery, showing the king's power to encompass and protect the entire kingdom. For a king to run around the walls of his capital was to physically claim it, to declare his cosmic right to protect every brick and every subject within. It was a visible testament to his endless strength, a necessary piece of propaganda in a new unified kingdom. Khepri stared at the drawing, a new kind of understanding dawning on him. The rituals were not just abstract religious performances, they were grounded in the hard-won reality of statecraft. The said festival, which he would celebrate in the coming years, wasn't just a renewal of his Ka. It was a reminder to his people that the divine authority they relied on was still strong, still vibrant. It was a political rally as much as it was a sacred rite. Imhotep pointed to another detail on the tablet: the appearance of the king festival. The Palermo stone records that this was an annual event. Every year the king would appear before his people in his ceremonial regalia. This was a public reaffirmation of his divine rule, a spectacle of power that kept the kingdom unified and loyal. It was a way for the people, especially those in the distant provinces, to see their divine ruler, to feel his presence, and to know that the cosmic order was secure. In an age before mass communication, a single annual appearance by the pharaoh was a vital touchstone, a point of unity for all the disparate tribes and regions of the two lands. It was a yearly act of political theater, a reminder that their lives, their prosperity, and their very existence were dependent on the divine presence of their king. Khepri looked out at the desert, the wind whipping up small clouds of sand. He thought of his own grand procession down the Nile, and he realized its profound connection to these early rites. The journey was not about leisure. It was about the appearance of the king. It was about reenacting the very acts of unification that had created his nation. The early pharaohs, with their far more fragile grip on power, had needed these public spectacles to hold their kingdom together. His own procession was a direct continuation of this strategy, a timeless method of securing the loyalty of his subjects. The vizier then spoke of a more mundane but equally significant ritual recorded on the stone, the counting of the cattle. This was a census, a survey of the nation's wealth. Even in the earliest days, Imhotep said, the kings understood that divine power had to be backed by economic power. The count was a sacred ritual, but it served the very practical purpose of assessing the nation's wealth and ensuring the collection of taxes. The king was the provider, the one who secured prosperity, and this ritual was a public promise of that. To Khepri's astonishment, he saw that the divine duties of a pharaoh were inextricably tied to the worldly affairs of his kingdom. Standing there in the shadow of ancient tombs, surrounded by the remnants of the first dynasties, Khepri realized that his reign was not a new chapter, but a continuation of the oldest story. The rituals of his coronation, the purification, the donning of the crowns. The processions were all echoes of a time when these acts were the only things holding the nascent kingdom together. He was not just a new king. He was the living culmination of 5,000 years of divine tradition and political struggle. His own ascent to divinity was not just a personal transformation. It was the sacred, unbroken link to the very origin of Egypt itself. His body, his life, his reign were all part of a single, continuous, eternal, cosmic order. He felt a powerful new surge of confidence. He was not a usurper, not a mere heir. He was the direct descendant of the men who had forged the two lands, and his coronation was a sacred oath to continue their work. His ascent was not his own. It belonged to all of Egypt. The grand sun-drenched exterior of the temple faded away, replaced by the cool, echoing silence of the inner sanctum. This was the Pharaoh, the great house, a place older than the stone around it, a vessel for a power older still. The political tour, the historical reverence for the Palermo stone, the grand processions, all of it was prologue. Now Khepri alone, save for the highest priests, stood on the precipice of his true destiny. The man he was about to become, the god-king who would rule all of Egypt, was not forged in spectacle or ritual alone. He was forged in the union of his mortal body with an immortal essence. He was here to receive the royal Ka. In the Egyptian spiritual cosmos, every person had a Ka, a life force, a spiritual double created at birth. But the Pharaoh's Ka was unique. It was a divine, unending flow of life, passed down from the very beginning of creation. It had resided within the first king, the god falcon Horus himself, and had been passed unbroken from one pharaoh to the next. This Ka was the source of his divine authority, the very reason his reign brought cosmic order, and his absence brought chaos. Khepri had to become one with it. He was led to a small enclosed shrine, its walls inscribed with the names of every pharaoh before him. The air was heavy, charged with a palpable energy. The only light came from a single oil lamp, its flame casting long dancing shadows on the hieroglyphs of his ancestors. He felt a sense of profound, crushing solitude. He was a man waiting to be unmade. The lead priest, his face a stoic mask, stood before a pedestal upon which rested a small, enigmatic statue. It was not of a god, but of a man with two raised arms, the sign for Ka in hieroglyphs. The statue seemed to shimmer in the dim light, a vessel for an invisible power. The priest's voice, a low rumble, broke the silence. The Ka of your father's father, and all the fathers before him awaits. It is the life force of the kingship. It is the essence of order. It is the very soul of the two lands. Open yourself, my lord, and receive the spirit that will make you a god. Khepri closed his eyes, his heart hammering against his ribs. He felt the ancient fear, the ultimate vulnerability. He was a man, and he was about to be filled with something that was not man. He felt a cool breeze against his skin, though the air was still and thick. The chanting began not a chorus this time, but a single resonant hum, a vibration that seemed to emanate from the very stone itself. It was the sound of 1,000 generations, a call to a divine essence. The priest raised the Ka statue from its pedestal. It was not a physical act, but a spiritual one. Khepri felt a pressure on his forehead, a point of light. It was not a touch, but a spiritual presence. And then he felt it. Not a gentle flow, but an overwhelming torrent. It was as if 1,000 rivers had just converged into a single point, rushing into his very being. The feeling was a blinding kaleidoscope of sensations. He saw not just the faces of his ancestors, but felt their lives. He felt the weight of Imhotep's wisdom, the cunning of a long-dead queen, the stubborn pride of the first unified king. He was a single vessel, but he now held the consciousness of an entire dynasty. He felt the fear of the early pharaohs, the struggle to hold the two lands together. He felt the quiet confidence of the pyramid builders, the unshakable certainty of a god on earth. He saw images flash before his eyes, the Nile, in flood an endless, shimmering artery of life. The desert, a vast, silent ocean of sand. The temples not as monuments of stone, but as living, breathing entities, their columns reaching into the sky like supplicating hands. He was no longer looking at the world. He was experiencing it from within. He was a part of it, the very head and heart of it. His perception of his own body changed. The exhaustion of his long journey, the fatigue of the rituals, all of it vanished, replaced by a boundless, tireless energy. He felt his blood not as a simple liquid, but as a divine fluid coursing with the power of the sun itself. He felt the weight of his false beard not as an ornament, but as a tangible symbol of his timeless power. His limbs, once mortal flesh, felt as if they were made of granite and gold, unshakable and eternal. The process of receiving the Ka was an act of profound self-sacrifice. Khepri the man was utterly subsumed. His personal anxieties, his memories of childhood, his small moments of humanity were washed away, replaced by the collective consciousness of his divine lineage. He was no longer Khepri. He was the king, the Nisat Biti, the living Horus. He had died and been reborn in the span of a single night. The chanting ceased. The silence that fell was not empty but full. It was a silence that held the promise of 1 billion sunrises, the endless flow of the Nile, the constant beat of the cosmic order. The lead priest approached him, his eyes now filled with a genuine awe and reverence. He did not touch Khepri. To do so would be to touch a god. He simply knelt, his head bowed. The Ka has entered its vessel. The priest whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Horus has returned to the throne. Khepri felt a single profound tear track a path down his cheek. It was a tear not of sorrow or joy, but of a quiet, immense understanding. He had not cried as a man. He had cried as a god, a single drop of a divine ocean, a symbol of the profound and terrifying responsibility that was now his. He was now the shepherd of a universe, the keeper of Ma'at, the embodiment of order itself. He had not asked for this. He had been born to it, and now he had accepted it. He opened his eyes. The world looked different. The dim light of the oil lamp was not just a flame, it was a beacon, a living extension of the sun god Ra. The stone walls were not just rock. They were the very bones of the earth, a part of the vast, intricate body of which he was now the head. He saw the priests not as men, but as cogs in a cosmic machine, each with their own sacred duty. He saw the world in its entirety, as a divine, interconnected organism, and he felt the profound, endless love for the people he was now charged to protect, not as a king loves his subjects, but as a god loves his creation. This was the first night of the Pharaoh, the moment of his true birth. He had entered the chamber a man and had emerged a god. The ritual was not about the power to rule. It was about the divine nature of that rule. The royal Ka was not just a title. It was a life, a purpose, a boundless eternal essence. Khepri had received it. His long, terrifying ascent to divinity was complete. He would now walk among men, but he would no longer be one of them. The air within the royal chambers was thick, not with incense or perfume, but with a profound, final stillness. The life of Pharaoh Menkor, the living embodiment of Horus, had dwindled to a single, shallow breath. The silence that followed was more deafening than any thunder. The two figures who stood vigil by his gilded bed, the high priest, and the wizened vizier Imhotep, did not utter a word of mourning. Their grief, a powerful and private emotion, was utterly and immediately subsumed by a far greater, more terrifying responsibility. A god had died, and for the universe to survive, another had to be born. In the ancient Egyptian worldview, the world was a delicate balance of cosmic order known as Ma'at. The sun rose, the Nile flooded, the seasons turned, all because Ma'at was maintained. But the sole guarantor, the living cornerstone of this order, was the Pharaoh. He was the divine link between the mortal realm and the cosmos. His death was not just the end of a life. It was the moment Ma'at began to fray. Without a living god on the throne, the universe would descend into Isfet chaos. The sun might not rise in the morning. The Nile, the very lifeblood of the nation, might fail to flood. Famine and pestilence would sweep the land, for the divine protection had been broken. It was a race against time, a desperate act of faith and statecraft to close the terrifying gap between one pharaoh's last breath and his successor's first. The very second the vizier Imhotep confirmed the old king's passing, his face, etched with a moment of sorrow, became a mask of resolute duty. He did not look at the body of his friend and king. He turned his eyes searching for the young man who now stood in a shadowed corner of the room. Khepri, the son of the king. He was not yet pharaoh. He was just a prince's son, his face still streaked with tears of a boy grieving his father. Imhotep's voice, a low and urgent whisper, cut through the quiet. "My lord," he said, and the title, "My Lord," was a solemn declaration. "The sun will not wait. We must." Khepri looked at him, his mind still clouded by grief. He saw the cold, determined urgency in the vizier's eyes, an urgency that transcended all human emotion. The high priest of Amun, a gaunt man with a serene, unreadable face, stepped forward. He carried a small, unadorned box of polished ebony. This was the moment. This was the immediate succession, a ceremony so brief and so vital, it was not even a ceremony. It was an act. Imhotep gently took Khepri's arm and guided him to a central spot in the chamber, away from the bed of the deceased king. The high priest opened the ebony box and removed a simple, unadorned ring, the seal of kingship. It was not the great ceremonial pshent crown, nor the elaborate names headdress. It was a single plain band of gold, its surface inscribed with the names of the first pharaohs. This ring was the portable, immediate symbol of the royal Ka. It was the very soul of the kingship, and it had to be transferred from the departed god to the new one without a moment's pause. The high priest placed the ring on Khepri's finger. It was cold and heavy. As he did so, he spoke a single sacred phrase, a sentence so old, it was rumored to be the very first words ever spoken by Ra. "The two lands are whole again." The words were a decree, a magical act. Khepri felt the transition. It was not the lightning bolt of the full coronation, not the overwhelming torrent of the royal Ka that he would feel in the coming days. It was a subtle but profound shift. The overwhelming grief that had consumed him moments before receded, not gone, but pushed to the side, replaced by an immense sense of purpose and a cold, clear clarity. He was no longer just a son. He was the king. The divine protection of the nation, the sacred flow of Ma'at, had been re-established through him. The world was safe, for now. This immediate naming of a successor was a cornerstone of ancient Egyptian statecraft and theology. The entire system was built on the terrifying premise that the death of a pharaoh was a moment of supreme vulnerability for the entire cosmos. Any delay, any power struggle, any moment of chaos could tear the fragile tapestry of Ma'at apart, leading to a cosmic catastrophe. The swiftness of the succession was the ultimate safeguard. The priests, the viziers, and the royal family all understood this. They were not just naming a new ruler. They were performing a sacred duty to prevent the universe from unraveling. The contrast between the silent grief of the son and the immediate action of the vizier and priest was stark. For Khepri, this moment was a painful reminder of his new divine existence. He could not mourn as a man. His sorrow was secondary to his duty as a god. He was no longer a person with personal emotions. He was a vessel, a living conduit for the divine, and his first and only function was to maintain the cosmic order. The world outside the palace gates, the millions of his subjects, depended on his every action. This theological imperative was woven into the very fabric of Egyptian life. The royal succession was not a political process, it was a cosmic one. The elaborate year-long coronation that would follow was simply a public manifestation of this private, immediate act. The purification rituals, the symbolic donning of the crowns, the processions all were designed to publicly declare and reinforce the fact that the sacred link had been restored. The pharaoh had died, but the kingship lived on. Khepri stood alone in the dim chamber, the cold gold of the ring on his finger, a physical reminder of his new reality. His father's body lay still on the bed, and in the corner the priests were already preparing the body for its journey to the afterlife. Khepri felt a new, unfamiliar weight on his shoulders. The boy who had cried for his father was gone, replaced by a king who had to save the world. The world was safe, the sun would rise, the Nile would flood. The divine Ka had found its new home, and the cosmic order was for the moment secure. He was not just a king, he was a living prayer, a silent testament to the ancient terrifying truth that a nation's survival was balanced on the shoulders of one man, one God who could never ever falter. The great processional hall was a world of shimmering light and vibrant color. Sunlight filtered through high, narrow windows fell in great golden shafts, illuminating the painted scenes of pharaohs past and their divine deeds, the air heavy with the scent of temple incense, and the sweat of 1,000 waiting bodies crackled with an energy that was both sacred and intensely political. Khepri, the newly anointed pharaoh, his mortal identity already shed in the private ritual, stood at the threshold of this vast space. He had been purified, anointed, and imbued with the royal Ka. Now he was ready to display his divine right to the world. The transition from the hushed solemnity of the inner sanctum to the public spectacle was jarring, a powerful reminder that his reign was a performance, a grand piece of political theater designed to secure his rule. The first and most critical act was the unification of the two lands, a ritual so central to the pharaoh's identity that it was an essential component of the coronation. It was not enough to simply be king. He had to demonstrate his mastery over both Upper and Lower Egypt. A great gilded double throne had been placed at the center of the hall, one side facing the north, the other the south. A priest stood on each side, representing the two halves of the kingdom. One held a single stalk of papyrus, the symbolic plant of the north, while the other held a single lotus blossom, the sacred flower of the south. The plants, separate and distinct, represented the two lands in their pre-unified state. Khepri walked forward, his stride long and deliberate. He first ascended the throne facing the south, and for a long, silent moment, he sat his gaze fixed on the lotus blossom. His mind, now a vast repository of the royal Ka, recalled the images of the Upper Kingdom, the rugged, stony landscape of the Valley of the Kings, the relentless heat of the desert, the fierce, independent spirit of the southern tribes. He was not just sitting on a chair. He was symbolically encompassing a third of his kingdom. Then, with a slow, powerful movement, he rose and walked to the other throne, the one facing the north. He sat, and his eyes fell upon the papyrus stalk. He saw in his mind's eye the lush green of the delta, the fertile mud of the Nile, the intricate network of canals, the bustling life of the city of Memphis. He was a god, but a god with a body, and that body, in a simple act of sitting, declared his dominion over 1,000 miles of land and millions of souls. Then the two priests approached the great throne, and with a series of solemn incanted gestures they tied the papyrus and lotus together, binding them in a tight knot. The Sematawi, the joining of the two lands, was complete. Khepri rose from the double throne and now stood between the two tied plants. He was the living knot, the one who held the nation together. He had transformed the two separate lands from a political alliance into a single, cohesive entity. He then proceeded to put on the pshent, the double crown of visual confirmation of the act he had just performed. The white crown of the south and the red crown of the north were now one their joined weight, a physical manifestation of the immense responsibility he had just assumed. The hall erupted in a roar of approval, a sound that was less a cheer and more a declaration of allegiance. But the catalogue of rites was far from complete. The unification was merely the first chapter. Next came the public procession, a carefully orchestrated spectacle designed to bring the new Pharaoh to his people. Khepri emerged from the hall and onto a great open plaza, a sea of faces stretching to the horizon. He was dressed not just in the pshent, but in the full regalia of his office. In one hand he carried the Waz scepter, the symbol of his divine power and dominion. In the other he carried the Ankh, the key of life, a physical representation of his ability to grant life and prosperity to his people. As he walked, his stride was not a human one. It was measured, slow, and imbued with a sense of immense unshakable power. The crowds which had been silent in awe began to cheer his name, not the name he had been given as a child, but his new royal names. The priests now surrounded him, and one by one they presented him with his new identities. The first was his Horus name, the one that linked him directly to the falcon god. The priest spoke a single word, a name that signified his divine essence. The crowd in a chorus repeated it back. The second was his Nebdi name, he of the two ladies, linking him to the vulture goddess of the south and the cobra goddess of the north. Another name, a different aspect of his power. The third was his golden Horus's name, a direct link to the sun god Ra. A golden falcon, the symbol of Horus, was raised high above the crowd. The fourth was his prenomen, the throne name, and the fifth was his nomen, his birth name, written within a cartouche, a magical rope that contained the sun itself. Each name was a new layer of his identity, a new aspect of his divine purpose. He was no longer just a man. He was a series of powerful sacred titles, an institution of divinity. After the naming ceremony, the procession began its slow, majestic journey. The Pharaoh was carried on a gilded litter, a moving temple of power, its every inch a testament to his divine right. As he was carried through the streets of Memphis, the white walls of the city seemed to shimmer in the sun, a beacon of his rule. The procession was a visible demonstration of his long-term power and permanence. It was a spectacle that would not be forgotten. Every child who saw it would grow up knowing their Pharaoh was a god. Every farmer who knelt on the side of the road would go back to his fields with a renewed sense of purpose, knowing his hard work was a sacred duty to his divine ruler. The final, and perhaps most physically demanding ritual, was the running of the walls, a ceremony that was a direct callback to the earliest kings of Egypt. Khepri, after the long, tiring procession, had to physically run around the great walls of Memphis. It was an act of profound symbolism. It was a physical and symbolic act of mastery, showing the king's power to encompass and protect the entire kingdom. He was not just the ruler of the people. He was the keeper of their safety, the guardian of their homes and their prosperity. The act was a grueling test of his physical endurance, a visceral demonstration of his power and his youth. It was a promise to his people that his strength, like the sun, would never fade. The catalog of key coronation rites was not a checklist of duties. It was a masterclass in political power and religious propaganda. The rituals, each one a different facet of the same divine truth, worked in concert to create a reality that was both sacred and unshakable. The private ceremony in the inner sanctum had made him a god. The public spectacle on the city streets had made him a king. The unification ritual, the naming ceremony, the great procession, the running of the walls, all of them worked together to cement his authority in the minds and hearts of his people. His rule was not a choice, it was a cosmic inevitability. He was not a king who ruled, but the rule itself. The great processional gate of the palace groaned open on its massive hinges, a sound like a waking giant. Beyond it, a world of noise and light exploded into Khepri's consciousness. After the cool, dim sanctity of the inner sanctum, where his soul had been filled with a royal cow and his mortal identity meticulously shed, the outside was a shock to the senses. The sun, Ra himself, beat down with a relentless, blinding brilliance, a physical force on his skin. Before him, stretching as far as his newly divine eyes could see, was a vast, pulsating ocean of humanity. The roar of the crowd was a physical thing, a living, breathing creature of sound, its collective voice, a deafening roar of adoration and relief. They were not just subjects, they were witnesses. And he, their new god-king, was the spectacle they had been waiting for. He stood on the threshold, the full weight of his regalia heavy upon him, the pshent, the double crown, its joined weight, a constant physical reminder of his dominion over the two lands, the false beard, a golden, plaited symbol of his eternal nature, the linen kilt so starkly white against his gilded skin. In his hands he clutched the Waz scepter and the Ankh, the key of life. These were not props, they were extensions of his divine being. He felt their power, a familiar hum that resonated with the new life force flowing through his veins. The first and most critical act was the physical public enactment of the unification of the two lands, a ritual known as the Sematawi. This was the heart of his political legitimacy, the moment he would declare for all to see that he and he alone could bind the separate halves of the kingdom into a single, cohesive entity. A grand open-air pavilion had been erected, its columns carved with the faces of the ancient gods. In the center, two figures waited, one representing the north, one the south. The northern representative, a high priest from the delta, carried a single, graceful stalk of papyrus, the symbolic plant of the lower kingdom. The southern representative, a powerful general from Elephantine, held a single, vibrant lotus blossom, the sacred flower of the upper kingdom. Khepri descended the steps, each footstep a deliberate sacred act. He walked to the northern priest first, and with a regal nod accepted the papyrus stalk. He held its smooth stem, his divine mind already seeing, beyond the plant, to the vast, fertile delta, the network of canals, the bustling cities, the very souls of his people in the north. He then turned, and with the same solemnity, accepted the lotus blossom from the southern general. His fingers closed around its delicate petals, and he felt the spiritual presence of the upper kingdom, the stark, rugged beauty of its mountains, the unwavering loyalty of its people. The two plants in his hands were not just flora. They were the very soul of his nation, divided and distinct. He brought the two plants together, and in a silent, powerful gesture, he wrapped them around each other, binding them in a tight, inseparable knot. He was the knot. He was the living, breathing, divine bond that held his kingdom together. He then raised the bound plants above his head, and a fresh wave of cheers erupted from the crowd. It was a roar of recognition, and acceptance. The people saw their divided world, their regional differences, their local allegiances, and they saw a single unifying force in their new king. The Semitawi was not a myth. It was a visible, living reality, an act of sacred statecraft that solidified his divine power and his political dominance. He was the master of both lands, and he had shown it. With the unification complete, the royal procession began its majestic journey through the streets of Memphis, the city of the white walls, the ancient capital of Egypt. Khepri was carried on a magnificent gilded litter, a moving temple of power borne on the shoulders of 12 high officials. Banners and standards, each a sacred symbol of a different nome or province of Egypt, fluttered in the breeze. The sound of trumpets and drums thundered a majestic rhythm, a single, powerful heartbeat for the entire nation. As he was carried forward, Khepri's gaze swept over the crowds. This was not a passive audience. They were participants, their hands raised in supplication, and awe were a physical testament to his power. He saw their faces, their eyes wide with a mixture of reverence and relief. They had feared the chaos that would follow his father's death, but now seeing the symbols of his divine rule, they knew order had been restored. He saw the proud, sun-worn face of a farmer from the Delta, the intricate beaded headdress of a noble from Thebes, the stoic gaze of a soldier from the Nubian border. Each face was a single, precious thread in the great tapestry of his kingdom, and he, the Pharaoh, was the weaver. The procession moved at a deliberate, stately pace. The goal was not speed, but visibility. Every man, woman, and child had to see their king. Every detail of his regalia, every gesture of his hand, every step of the high officials carrying him, it was all designed to be seen, to be remembered, to be a source of faith and loyalty. The Waz scepter in his hand was not just a stick, it was his divine power. The Ankh was not just a loop, it was the promise of a bountiful harvest, a full Nile flood, and a long life. The procession was a living, moving sermon, a constant visual affirmation of the divine contract between the king and his people. The journey was long, and Khepri, despite his newfound divine energy, felt the physical toll of the heat and the constant, unwavering concentration required of him. He was a statue, a living effigy of a god, and he could not afford a single lapse. He had to be perfect, flawless, a living testament to the power of Ma'at. The procession would end at the great temple of Ptah, where he would make a final public offering to the god of artisans and creators, a final act of devotion to the creator, god of Memphis, before the most grueling part of the day began. The sun was setting its golden light, casting long shadows across the white walls of Memphis. The crowd, though tired, was still buzzing with energy. Khepri, having completed his long procession, was now prepared for the final and most physically demanding ritual of the public coronation, the running of the walls. This was a test of his physical strength, a visceral demonstration of his power and his youth. It was an act that harked back to the first kings who had to be powerful men as well as divine rulers. He stood at a starting line, still in his full regalia, his gaze fixed on the great whitewashed mud brick wall that encircled the city. The priest gave a signal, and he began to run. He was not alone. A select group of priests ran with him, but they were no match for his strength. He was a god king, running his long legs, pumping, the weight of the double crown, a physical challenge. He ran not for speed, but for endurance, for power, for the sake of the kingdom. With every step, he symbolically claimed his dominion over every inch of the city, every brick of its walls, every soul within it. The cheers of the crowd, which had been loud before, now reached a fever pitch. This was not the remote, unapproachable God of the inner sanctum. This was a king who was strong, a god who was here on the ground protecting them with his own 2 feet. The unification and royal procession was not just a chapter in his story. It was a testament to the fact that his rule was not an abstract concept. It was a tangible, physical reality. He had shown the people in no uncertain terms that he was the living bond that held their world together. The private ritual had made him a god. The public spectacle had made him a king. And as he crossed the finish line, exhausted but unbowed, the walls of Memphis stood as a silent, unwavering testament to the fact that his rule was now an unshakable, permanent part of the cosmos. The cosmic order had been restored, and the entire kingdom, from the highest noble to the lowliest peasant, had witnessed its rebirth. The first decade of Khepri's reign had passed in a blur of ceaseless ritual and administration. The grand year-long coronation was a memory, a magnificent spectacle that had announced his divine authority to the world. But a god's work is never done. The initial roar of popular adoration, the fever of the Sematawi, had settled into a more predictable rhythm. The challenge now was not to establish his divinity, but to maintain it. In a kingdom as vast and complex as Egypt, where the word of the Pharaoh had to travel for months to reach its farthest outposts, his divine authority had to be constantly reinforced visually and emotionally. It could not be taken for granted. To this end, his reign was punctuated by a series of great feasts and festivals, each one a carefully orchestrated piece of political and religious theater designed to keep Ma'at at the forefront of his people's minds and to continually renew the sacred bond between the king and his subjects. The first of these was the annual Appearance of the King festival. It was not as grand as the coronation, but its regularity made it perhaps more potent. Each year on the anniversary of his crowning, Khepri would be unveiled to his people in a grand public ceremony. A great pavilion adorned with banners of the gods and symbols of his power was erected in the heart of Memphis. The crowds would begin to gather at dawn, a vast, expectant sea of faces that stretched into the distance. Khepri dressed in the full splendor of his regalia. The pshent crown, the waz scepter, the ankh, would ascend a great stepped dais. As the sun reached its zenith, a gilded curtain would be drawn back, revealing him to the multitude. The sight was designed to be overwhelming. For many, this would be their only chance to see their god on earth. They did not see Khepri the man. They saw the living Horus, the son of Ra. He would stand there perfectly still, his face a mask of divine serenity. He would hold the waz scepter aloft, a single, powerful gesture that symbolized his dominion over the universe. A choir of priests would chant his divine names, their voices amplified by the vast hall. The crowd, in a single, powerful motion, would fall to its knees, their foreheads touching the dusty ground. This was not a greeting. It was an act of worship. For a brief, powerful moment, the entire kingdom, from the highest noble to the lowliest farmer, was united in a single act of reverence. The appearance of the king was a constant visual reminder that the cosmic order was secure, that the Pharaoh was still strong, and that his divine protection had not wavered. But the most significant of all these festivals was the Sed festival, or Hebsed, a ceremony so ancient its origins were lost to the sands of time. It was a jubilee typically celebrated after 30 years of a pharaoh's reign. The festival was born of a brutal, primitive truth. In the earliest days, a king who grew old and feeble was ritually sacrificed, his life force transferred to a younger, more vigorous successor to ensure the strength of the kingdom. Over millennia, this practice evolved. The Sed festival became a symbolic renewal, a ritual where the aging king proved his continued vitality and renewed his divine power, ensuring the kingdom would not suffer from his decline. Khepri, now a seasoned monarch with a quarter-century on the throne, began the preparations for his first said festival. The festival itself was not a single event, but a month-long extravaganza that would draw pilgrims from every corner of Egypt. It was a grand national recoronation, a complete reenactment of the sacred rituals that had once transformed him from a man into a god. The entire city of Memphis was transformed into a festival ground. Temples were decorated, new shrines were built, and the air was filled with the sounds of music and celebration. The first act of the festival was a series of symbolic re-coronations. Khepri would once again be purified, his body anointed with sacred oils. He would once again don the crowns, the white crown of the south, the red crown of the north, and finally the pshent, the double crown. It was not an empty gesture. For the Egyptians, it was a profound act of spiritual renewal. The divine Ka, which might have been weakened by the passage of time, was now re-infused, re-energized. The most anticipated and celebrated part of the said festival was the running of the said, a grueling symbolic foot race. On the final day of the festival, Khepri would emerge from the temple, his body still and strong, his face radiating a serene power. Before him, an open field was laid out, its path marked by two cones, one representing Upper Egypt, the other Lower Egypt. The pharaoh had to run a full circuit around the field, his run a symbolic act of mastery over the entire kingdom. He was not just a symbol. He was a living, breathing testament to his enduring strength. Khepri, now a middle-aged man by mortal standards, would run the race with the vigor of a youth. The crowds watching from a distance would cheer him on, their roars a collective prayer that his strength would not fail. His triumphant completion of the race was not just a personal victory, it was a cosmic one. It proved to his people, to the gods, and to the universe itself that he was still a living, vital force capable of maintaining the cosmic order. After the race, Khepri would sit on a said throne, a symbol of his renewed divine reign, and preside over a series of ceremonies and offerings. He would be presented with gifts from every nome, a visual display of his dominion over the entire kingdom. He would grant new titles, issue new decrees, and bestow royal patronage on his most loyal subjects. These acts, done with the full weight of his renewed authority, were far more than simple administration. They were the very fabric of his rule, woven into the sacred cycle of his life. The said festival and the appearance of the king were not just celebrations. They were living, breathing proof of the pharaoh's divinity. They were a constant, visible reminder that his power was not a static thing, but a dynamic, ever-renewing force. They were how a god-king in a world without photographs or mass media kept the faith of his people alive. They were how he held Maat in his hands, one grand spectacle at a time. Through these festivals, the pharaoh's rule was not only established, but perpetually reinforced, ensuring the stability and prosperity of his kingdom for decades to come. His reign was not just a period of time. It was a cycle of renewal, a continuous living testament to his eternal power. The great stone doors of the treasuries swung open, groaning on their ancient pivots, and the cool, dry air within carried the scent of papyrus and dust. Khepri, now well into his reign, walked past towering shelves of gilded chests and scrolls. The symbols of his power, the pshent, crowned the Waz scepter, were all here secured and catalogued. Yet the most potent objects were not the gold or the jewels. He stopped before a small alabaster statue no more than a foot high. It depicted him, the king, as an adult man, his powerful body fully formed. But he was seated in the lap of a majestic, seated goddess. On her serene face, a vision of divine grace was turned down towards his. Her arm was around his shoulder, and his head was turned towards her breast, from which he was in a silent, powerful gesture, receiving her divine milk. This was the symbolic suckling of the king, a rite as old as the sixth dynasty, and it was a public declaration of a profoundly intimate spiritual truth. In a kingdom where power was constantly being consolidated and re-legitimized, this ritual, though seemingly gentle, was a political masterstroke. It was an answer to a single critical question: where did the Pharaoh get his divine authority? The great coronation had provided the public answer: the transference of the royal Ka. The said festival had provided the physical proof the king's unending vitality. But the symbolic suckling provided the ultimate, most sacred origin story: the Pharaoh was the son of a goddess. The concept was born during a period of immense political and religious change. The Old Kingdom, the age of the Great Pyramids, was giving way to an era of decentralization. The power of the local nobles and priesthoods was on the rise, and the absolute authority of the Pharaoh was for the first time being questioned. The suckling ritual was a direct counterargument, a piece of sophisticated religious propaganda. It proclaimed that the Pharaoh's power did not come from a noble line, a successful conquest, or a mere ritual. It came from a divine birth, a sacred lineage that transcended all human politics. The image, powerful and evocative, was a constant visual reminder to the people that their king was no mere man. He was the divine child nurtured and protected by the gods themselves. The figurine in the treasury was one of many. These sacred statues and reliefs were placed in the temples of Thebes, Memphis, and beyond. They were not just art. They were living prayers, tangible vessels of a sacred truth. The iconography was always precise. The goddess was most often Isis or Hathor, her face radiating a serene power. Her arm, a symbol of divine protection, was always around the king's shoulder. And the king himself was always depicted as a man, never as a child. This was crucial. It was not a depiction of a mortal childhood, but of a divine, eternal bond. The act of suckling was not about physical sustenance. It was about the transference of divine wisdom, power, and immortality. The milk of the goddess was a metaphor for the sacred essence of the gods, the very life force that made the Pharaoh a living god. As Khepri looked at the figurine, his mind drifted to the myth of Isis and Horus. After the murder of Osiris, Isis had fled into the delta where she gave birth to Horus. She had nurtured him, suckling him on her divine milk, raising him to be strong enough to challenge his uncle Set and reclaim his divine inheritance. The Pharaoh, as the living Horus, was reenacting this eternal myth. Every time a priest saw this relief, every time a noble saw this figurine, they were not just seeing a statue, they were witnessing a divine truth. The king, like Horus, had been nurtured by a goddess. He was the protector of his father's legacy, the rightful heir to the divine throne, and the one who would ultimately restore order to a chaotic world. This powerful visual message was a psychological anchor for the kingdom. The grand festivals and processions were magnificent, but they were momentary. The small, intimate figurines, the temple reliefs, they were eternal. They were a constant, quiet presence that reassured the people. The image of the king, a god-man in the lap of a loving goddess, was a powerful, humanizing symbol. It made the distant, abstract idea of a divine ruler feel personal, tangible, and emotionally resonant. The people did not have to understand the complexities of the royal Kai or the political intricacies of the said festival. All they had to understand was this: their king was protected by the gods. He was their child, their champion, and their divine protector. The goddess, by nurturing him, was also nurturing them, her people. The act of suckling also served to differentiate the pharaoh from his priests and officials. While they were servants of the gods, he was their son. While they could communicate with the divine, he was a living part of it. This simple, intimate gesture was a powerful way to reinforce his unique, unassailable position. He was not just a priest or a vizier with a better job. He was a divine entity, born and nurtured by a goddess. This was the ultimate argument for his absolute authority. Khepri reached out his hand, hovering over the cold, smooth alabaster of the statue. He was a god-king, yes, but he was also the embodiment of this simple, profound truth. He was a man who had been chosen by the divine, a child who had been nurtured by the gods, a king who had been granted the gift of immortality. He felt the weight of that responsibility not as a burden, but as a sacred privilege. He was the living proof that the gods loved Egypt and that their divine protection was alive and well in him. He turned and walked back into the bright sunlit corridor, a different man than when he had entered. The symbolic suckling of the king was not a public spectacle. It was a quiet, powerful truth, a constant presence in the background of his reign. It was the ultimate statement of his divine right, a silent, unshakable promise to his people that their god-king was born not of man, but of the divine, and that his power, like the sun, would never fade. He was the son of a goddess, and his rule was the sacred culmination of a love that was older than time. The great processional hall was a world of shimmering light and vibrant color. Sunlight filtered through high, narrow windows fell in great golden shafts, illuminating the painted scenes of pharaohs past and their divine deeds. The air, heavy with the scent of temple incense and the sweat of 1,000 waiting bodies, crackled with an energy that was both sacred and intensely political. Khepri, the newly anointed pharaoh, his mortal identity already shed in the private ritual, stood at the threshold of this vast space. He had been purified, anointed, and imbued with a royal ka. Now he was ready to display his divine right to the world. The transition from the hushed solemnity of the inner sanctum to the public spectacle was jarring, a powerful reminder that his reign was a performance, a grand piece of political theater designed to secure his rule. The first and most critical act was the physical public enactment of the unification of the two lands, a ritual known as the Sematawi. This was the heart of his political legitimacy, the moment he would declare for all to see that he and he alone could bind the separate halves of the kingdom into a single, cohesive entity. A grand open-air pavilion had been erected, its columns carved with the faces of the ancient gods. In the center, two figures waited, one representing the north, one the south. The northern representative, a high priest from the Delta, carried a single, graceful stalk of papyrus, the symbolic plant of the lower kingdom. The southern representative, a powerful general from Elephantine, held a single, vibrant lotus blossom, the sacred flower of the upper kingdom. Khepri descended the steps, each footstep a deliberate sacred act. He walked to the northern priest first, and with a regal nod accepted the papyrus stalk. He held its smooth stem, his divine mind already seeing beyond the plant, to the vast, fertile delta, the network of canals, the bustling cities, the very souls of his people in the north. He then turned, and with the same solemnity, accepted the lotus blossom from the southern general. His fingers closed around its delicate petals, and he felt the spiritual presence of the upper kingdom, the stark, rugged beauty of its mountains, the unwavering loyalty of its people. The two plants in his hands were not just flora. They were the very soul of his nation, divided and distinct. He brought the two plants together, and in a silent, powerful gesture, he wrapped them around each other, binding them in a tight, inseparable knot. He was the knot. He was the living, breathing divine bond that held his kingdom together. He then raised the bound plants above his head, and a fresh wave of cheers erupted from the crowd. It was a roar of recognition and acceptance. The people saw their divided world, their regional differences, their local allegiances, and they saw a single unifying force in their new king. The Semitawi was not a myth. It was a visible, living reality, an act of sacred statecraft that solidified his divine power and his political dominance. He was the master of both lands, and he had shown it. With the unification complete, the royal procession began its majestic journey through the streets of Memphis, the city of the white walls, the ancient capital of Egypt. Khepri was carried on a magnificent gilded litter, a moving temple of power borne on the shoulders of 12 high officials. Banners and standards, each a sacred symbol of a different nome or province of Egypt, fluttered in the breeze. The sound of trumpets and drums thundered a majestic rhythm, a single powerful heartbeat for the entire nation. As he was carried forward, Khepri's gaze swept over the crowds. This was not a passive audience. They were participants, their hands raised in supplication, and awe were a physical testament to his power. He saw their faces, their eyes wide with a mixture of reverence and relief. They had feared the chaos that would follow his father's death, but now seeing the symbols of his divine rule, they knew order had been restored. He saw the proud, sun-worn face of a farmer from the Delta, the intricate beaded headdress of a noble from Thebes, the stoic gaze of a soldier from the Nubian border. Each face was a single, precious thread in the great tapestry of his kingdom, and he, the Pharaoh, was the weaver. The procession moved at a deliberate, stately pace. The goal was not speed, but visibility. Every man, woman, and child had to see their king. Every detail of his regalia, every gesture of his hand, every step of the high officials carrying him, it was all designed to be seen, to be remembered, to be a source of faith and loyalty. The Waz scepter in his hand was not just a stick, it was his divine power. The Ankh was not just a loop, it was the promise of a bountiful harvest, a full Nile flood, and a long life. The procession was a living, moving sermon, a constant visual affirmation of the divine contract between the king and his people. The journey was long, and Khepri, despite his newfound divine energy, felt the physical toll of the heat and the constant, unwavering concentration required of him. He was a statue, a living effigy of a god, and he could not afford a single lapse. He had to be perfect, flawless, a living testament to the power of Ma'at. The procession would end at the great temple of Ptah, where he would make a final public offering to the god of artisans and creators, a final act of devotion to the creator god of Memphis, before the most grueling part of the day began. The sun was setting its golden light, casting long shadows across the white walls of Memphis. The crowd, though tired, was still buzzing with energy. Khepri, having completed his long procession, was now prepared for the final and most physically demanding ritual of the public coronation, the running of the walls. This was a test of his physical strength, a visceral demonstration of his power and his youth. It was an act that harked back to the first kings, who had to be powerful men as well as divine rulers. He stood at a starting line, still in his full regalia, his gaze fixed on the great, whitewashed mud brick wall that encircled the city. The priest gave a signal, and he began to run. He was not alone. A select group of priests ran with him, but they were no match for his strength. He was a god-king, running his long legs, pumping the weight of the double crown, a physical challenge. He ran not for speed, but for endurance, for power for the sake of the kingdom. With every step, he symbolically claimed his dominion over every inch of the city, every brick of its walls, every soul within it. The cheers of the crowd, which had been loud before, now reached a fever pitch. This was not the remote, unapproachable God of the inner sanctum. This was a king who was strong, a God who was here on the ground protecting them with his own 2 feet. The unification and royal procession was not just a chapter in his story. It was a testament to the fact that his rule was not an abstract concept. It was a tangible, physical reality. He had shown the people in no uncertain terms that he was the living bond that held their world together. The private ritual had made him a god. The public spectacle had made him a king. And as he crossed the finish line exhausted, but unbowed the walls of Memphis, stood as a silent, unwavering testament to the fact that his rule was now an unshakable, permanent part of the cosmos. The cosmic order had been restored, and the entire kingdom, from the highest noble to the lowliest peasant, had witnessed its rebirth. The journey was a slow, deliberate act of diplomacy. For weeks, the caravan had wound its way south and west, leaving the rugged, fertile lands of the Mitanni kingdom behind. Tani, daughter of the great king Tushratta, was a jewel in a gilded cage. She was not a person, but an asset. Her purpose was not her own to define. She was an instrument of statecraft, a living, breathing treaty, and her destination was the heart of Egypt, the palace of the Pharaoh Amenhotep. The marriage was not an affair of the heart, but an affair of nations. And as the distant, shimmering line of the Nile came into view, Tani felt a profound, chilling sense of her new reality. Her life, as she knew it, was over. The Egyptian welcome was as overwhelming as it was impersonal. They did not come as a groom's family to greet a bride, but as a state to receive a foreign dignitary. High officials, their linen kilts pristine and their faces impassive, met the caravan at the border. A fleet of barges, their sails decorated with the Ankh, and the falcon of Horus waited on the river. The grand journey down the Nile was not a romantic voyage. It was a procession, a moving display of power designed to show the Mitanni delegation that they had entered a world of a completely different order. The very river, the lifeblood of the nation, felt like a powerful living god. Tani sat on a raised litter, her gilded cage now a magnificent barge, and watched the life of Egypt unfold around her. The rhythmic call and response of the farmers in the fields, the bustling life of the villages, the silent, ancient majesty of the great temples that seemed to rise from the very earth itself. After a week of travel, they arrived in the sprawling, magnificent city of Memphis. The palace, with its brilliant white walls and soaring columns, was not a home. It was a monument to divine authority. Here in the heart of this sacred city, Tani would be wed. But the marriage was not a sacred rite sanctioned by the gods as her homelands were. It was a legal and social contract, a simple arrangement of cohabitation. For an Egyptian woman marrying an Egyptian man, rich or poor, the ceremony was simple. The bride would simply pack her belongings and move into the groom's home. The legal contract drawn up by scribes was the only thing that mattered. Love was a hope, a possibility, but never a prerequisite. For a pharaoh marrying a local noblewoman, it was even simpler. He was already a god, already married to the nation. A new wife was just a new part of the royal household, a new addition to the endless list of his duties and responsibilities. But a marriage to a foreign princess was different. It was an anomaly. It was a diplomatic act that required a public ceremony, a grand performance, to validate the alliance. Tani, as a daughter of a king, was a testament to the strength and power of her people. Her marriage to the pharaoh had to be seen. It had to be a statement. The ceremony was therefore not a celebration of a union between two souls, but a public anointing of a new political alliance. The day of the ceremony was a blur of ritual and formality. Tani was taken to a private chamber where a retinue of Egyptian priests and handmaidens awaited. They were not there to adorn her for a lover. They were there to make her worthy of a god. They stripped her of her foreign finery and dressed her in the sacred, simple linen of Egypt. They then began the anointing. This was not a ritual of beauty, but of spiritual cleansing. They rubbed sacred oils into her skin, their hands moving with a meticulous impersonal grace. The oil was meant to purify her, to wash away the foreignness from her being, to prepare her body as a vessel for a divine purpose. She was being transformed not into a bride, but into a part of the Pharaoh's divine household. The air was thick with the scent of myrrh and frankincense, scents she knew from her homeland, but here they felt different, colder, more sacred, less personal. After the anointing, the moment came for the public display. She was led out onto a grand open-air terrace where the entire court of Egypt was assembled. Before them, at the foot of the dais, stood her father's emissaries, their faces a mask of diplomatic pride. And there on a pedestal was her dowry. Her dowry was not a quiet, private gift. It was a testament to the wealth and power of her home kingdom, a public symbol of the immense value her marriage brought to Egypt. The vast dowry, meticulously listed in a diplomatic letter from her father, included countless objects of immense value. A horse-drawn chariot decorated with gold and lapis, lazuli, a life-size statue of a Hittite king, countless golden vessels, and a great pile of lapis, lazuli, a stone so rare and prized in Egypt that it was said to hold the very essence of the heavens. This was not a gift from a father to a son-in-law. It was a tribute from one king to another, a public declaration of the alliance that was now sealed by her body. Then Tani was carried in a magnificent, gilded litter to the inner chambers of the palace. She was not carried to a marital bedchamber, but to the royal harem. The harem, a separate wing of the palace, was not a place of pleasure, but a complex, meticulously managed institution. It was a community of women, the Pharaoh's wives, his secondary wives, his concubines, and their children. They were not a family in the traditional sense, but a political hierarchy. The first night was not a night of intimacy and romance. It was a night of administrative duty. She was introduced to the other women, each one a different face of the Pharaoh's power. There were princesses from other kingdoms, daughters of powerful Egyptian nobles, and women who had been chosen for their beauty or their grace. Tani had no special status, no unique claim on the Pharaoh's heart. She was a political piece, a new part of the royal mosaic, and her purpose was to bear an heir, a son who would carry a mix of Egyptian and Mitanni blood, a powerful symbol of their alliance. The Pharaoh himself was a distant, almost mythic figure. He did not come to her that night as a husband, but as a king. His visit was a brief, formal affair, a moment of duty rather than passion. He spoke to her not of her journey or her feelings, but of the prosperity of his kingdom, the health of his people, and the divine order he was charged to maintain. He was a god, a living monument, and she was a sacred part of his divine plan. There were no vows, no promises of love or eternal companionship. The contract had been signed, the dowry had been presented, and the anointing had been completed. The marriage was a done deal. Tani's new life was one of immense luxury, but also of profound solitude. She was a part of the most powerful court in the world, but her role was defined by her duty, not her desire. She was not a wife in the modern sense of the word. She was a political bridge between two empires, a living testament to an alliance and a vessel for the continuation of a divine dynasty. Her first night was not the culmination of a romance, but the solemn quiet beginning of a life lived for a purpose far greater than herself. Her body was a treaty, her life a contract, and her existence was a testament to the fact that for a pharaoh marriage was a matter of state, not of the heart. The antechamber of the royal study was a place of hushed, respectful silence. It was a space for the viziers, the high priests, and the most powerful generals to wait their hearts a drumbeat of anticipation for the moment the pharaoh, the living Horus, would grant them an audience. But for one figure, the path was always open. She was not a petitioner, she was a partner. Nefertari, the great royal wife, moved through the space with a grace born of absolute, unshakable confidence. The guards, their faces impassive, bowed low as she passed. She was not the king, but she was as close to his divine power as any mortal could be. Her existence was not a matter of romance, but of statecraft, and her role was a complex tapestry of duty, diplomacy, and immense quiet power. She was the other half of the divine equation. The pharaoh Khepri sat hunched over a map of the Nubian frontier, his brow furrowed in concentration. The vizier had just delivered troubling news of a local rebellion, a small flare-up of chaos on the southern border. Khepri, the god king, was also a general, a strategist, and a king who had to keep his people safe. He looked up as Nefertari entered, her linen kilt shimmering in the soft lamplight. She was not just a symbol. She was his closest confidant, his most trusted advisor. "My heart," he said, using the affectionate term he reserved for her in private moments. "The South flares up again. The vizier advises a punitive expedition, a strong show of force." Nefertari approached the table, her eyes scanning the map. She did not need to ask for details. She knew the political and economic landscape of the frontier as well as he did. She knew the Nubians were a proud, fierce people, their allegiance a fragile thing. A simple show of force might only harden their resolve. "And what of the river, my lord?" she asked, her voice calm and measured. "The great flood is due. A military campaign now would pull our finest soldiers from the fields, from the work of preparing for the Nile's generosity. It would leave the southern nomes vulnerable. They would see not a strong hand, but a reckless one." Khepri listened, his divine mind processing her words with a speed that transcended human thought. He had seen the problem as a matter of military strategy. She had seen it as a matter of cosmic order. The flood was Maat. The security of his people and the prosperity of his kingdom depended on it. Pulling his soldiers away from the life-giving work of the flood would be a foolish, arrogant act, a challenge to the very gods he represented. "Your wisdom is a gift from the gods, my queen," he said, his voice a low hum of respect. "What would you propose?" She knelt by his side, her finger tracing the path of a small, forgotten trading route on the map. She did not suggest a military campaign. She proposed a diplomatic mission, a trade agreement, and a carefully orchestrated display of royal generosity. She understood that power was not just about force, but about a network of loyalty, of obligation, and of shared prosperity. Her influence as an advisor was not a secret. It was a recognized vital part of the royal administration. She was a pharaoh in her own right, her power not divine but political. She managed a staff of scribes and messengers, her word carrying the full weight of the throne. She met with foreign ambassadors not as a hostess, but as a diplomat. Her letters to the queens of Babylon and Mitanni were not mere pleasantries. They were carefully crafted pieces of statecraft, filled with veiled threats and promises of alliance. Her position as the great royal wife was the most powerful female office in all of Egypt, a position that required a mind as sharp as a vizier's and a heart as strong as a general's. Beyond her advisory role, her power extended to a more intimate yet equally complex institution, the royal harem. The word to modern ears conjures images of a gilded cage filled with women for a king's pleasure. In ancient Egypt, the harem was a meticulously managed perchenet, or residence of women, a world within a world. It was a large, bustling compound, a community of women from every corner of the kingdom and beyond. There were the Pharaoh's secondary wives, often the daughters of powerful nobles whose marriage secured their family's loyalty. There were the foreign princesses like Tani from the Mitanni kingdom, whose presence was a living treaty. And there were countless concubines, women chosen for their beauty, their skill, their grace. Nefertari was not just a resident of this world. She was its undisputed master. Her power was not built on jealousy or rivalry, but on absolute authority. She was responsible for the well-being of every woman in the harem, for the education and health of their children, and for the smooth, harmonious functioning of the entire institution. She was the one who managed the immense wealth of the harem's estates, its fields, its farms, and its workshops. The harem was a powerful economic engine, a sprawling enterprise of weavers, brewers, and artisans, and Nefertari, the great royal wife, was its chief administrator. Her daily life was not a life of leisure, but a ceaseless series of meetings and administrative tasks, ensuring that this complex network of women and children was a source of dynastic stability, not of conflict. Her most sacred and profound duty, however, was the one that gave her the title of Great Royal Wife, the bearing of the heir. All the other wives and concubines could bear the pharaoh children, but only the son of the great royal wife was the most likely to be the successor. This was not a universal rule. Succession could and did go to the son of a secondary wife, but it was the social and political norm. The immense pressure of this duty was a constant silent presence in her life. Her body was not her own. It was a vessel for the continuation of the divine dynasty. She knew that her value, her power, her very existence was inextricably linked to her ability to produce a male heir, a son who would one day take on the royal Ka and become the living Horus. She recalled a night in the privacy of her chambers, the scent of jasmine from the garden drifting through the open window. She had just given birth to a son, the first of many. Khepri had entered his face, usually a mask of divine serenity, softened by a flicker of relief and pride. He had not looked at her. He had looked at the child. In that moment, she had understood her true role more clearly than ever before. She was not his lover. She was the mother of the future king. Her body had served a sacred divine purpose, and in doing so had secured the future of the two lands. Her final and most visible role was that of a public symbol of royal power. The pharaoh was a living god, but a god could seem remote, distant, and unapproachable. The great royal wife was a humanizing link, a more accessible face of the monarchy. She was often depicted alongside her husband in temple reliefs and on colossal statues. Her image, her face, was as recognizable to the Egyptian people as his. She was shown in the same size as the king, a powerful visual statement that her power was not secondary, but equal. She was a living embodiment of the goddess Isis, the divine partner to Horus. In public festivals and temple dedications, she stood beside the pharaoh, and the people did not just cheer for him. They cheered for her. She was a symbol of the unity, the prosperity, and the divine balance of the kingdom. Her power was not just behind the throne. It was on the throne beside him. The great royal wife was a paradox. She was a woman of immense political and administrative power, yet her life was utterly defined by her relationship to her husband and her ability to produce an heir. Her first night as a wife was not the culmination of a romance, but the beginning of a life of sacred political and administrative duty. She was not a wife in the modern sense of the word. She was a symbol of her nation, a diplomat for her kingdom, and a vessel for the divine bloodline that flowed through her veins. Her existence was a testament to the fact that in ancient Egypt, the most powerful woman was not a queen by birth, but a divine partner, chosen not for love, but for a destiny that would shape the future of the world. She was the other half of the divine equation, and without her the kingdom would not have been complete. The papyrus rustled softly under the young prince's hands. Horemheb, the future pharaoh, sat in the cool, shaded courtyard of the palace library, surrounded by the towering shelves of ancient scrolls. His tutor, the high priest of Thoth, the god of knowledge, watched him with a patient, knowing gaze. Horemheb's mind, sharp and inquisitive, had just posed a question that had a simple answer in the public square, but a far more complex one within these sacred walls. "Honorable teacher," the prince began, his voice a low hum, "the storytellers in the marketplace sing of the great heiress, the daughter of the Pharaoh. They say that the next king, even if he is the Pharaoh's son, must marry her to claim the throne. They say her blood is the very source of the royal ka. Is this true?" The high priest did not answer immediately. He picked up a small, polished stone, a fragment from a tomb of an ancient king, and turned it over in his hand. He then looked at the young prince with a serene smile. "The storytellers, my lord," he said, his voice as dry as the desert air, "weave tapestries of beautiful fictions for the people. The people in their wisdom want to believe that the gods are fair, that the divine path to the throne is a matter of love and blood. It is a comforting fable. But here in this place of truth, we must set aside the fiction and embrace the reality. The heiress theory is a beautiful lie. The truth is far simpler and far more demanding." The high priest then began to unspool the thread of history, a narrative that would debunk the popular myth and replace it with a hard, unromantic reality. He explained that modern Egyptology, through meticulous study of tomb records, administrative documents, and royal genealogies, had largely rejected this popular theory. The belief that a pharaoh had to marry the king's daughter, the royal heiress, to legitimize his reign, was a misinterpretation of a much more practical and deeply ingrained custom. The succession, he explained, was overwhelmingly and consistently patrilineal. It passed from father to son. The eldest living son of the pharaoh was the undisputed heir. The royal kai was not a mystical substance passed through the female line. It was a divine essence that flowed from one pharaoh to the next, a legacy of the sacred bond between the king and the god Horus. The son of the pharaoh was the next embodiment of Horus, and it was through his father that he received his divine right to rule. He pointed to a detailed family tree meticulously painted on a papyrus scroll. It showed the lineage of the pharaohs from the very first to the current one. The line, he explained, was a powerful, unbroken chain. The names were of the kings Menes, Djoser, Sneferu, Khufu, all the way to Khepri. The names of their wives were there too, but they were often of a different status. Sometimes the pharaoh's mother was a secondary wife. Sometimes the pharaoh's father was not even a king at all. The vizier then spoke of the common practice of royal incest. Pharaohs often married their sisters or half-sisters. The people believed this was to secure the heiress. The high priest explained, his voice low. But it was not so. It was to keep the divine bloodline pure, to consolidate power, and to prevent the dilution of the sacred royal ka. It was an act of political pragmatism, disguised as a holy act. It was not a ritual to gain power, but a ritual to keep it within the family where it belonged. He then cited a famous example that stood as the ultimate counterargument to the heiress theory. "Consider the great Akhenaten," the priest began, "who remade our religion and built a new city in the desert. His great royal wife was Nefertiti, a woman of immense power, beauty, and religious influence. She stood beside him on the reliefs, her image as large and as powerful as his. She was a pharaoh in her own right. But when he died, the throne did not pass to her. It passed to his son, the boy Tutankhamun. The boy's claim to the throne was based on his father's blood, not his stepmother's. Her power, immense as it was, did not give her the right to the throne. It was the royal Ka of Akhenaten, passed to his son, that secured the throne. The high priest continued explaining that the great royal wife's power was not diminished by this fact. On the contrary, her power was immense, but it was of a different kind. Her primary sacred and political duty was to bear the heir. She was the vessel for the divine bloodline, the mother of the future king. This was a sacred duty, one that elevated her to a status far beyond any other woman in the kingdom. She was the embodiment of the goddess Isis, the divine mother who had nurtured Horus. But she was not Horus himself. Her power was to nurture the pharaoh, to advise him to stand by his side as a divine partner. But she was not the one who held the scepter. Her power was in her influence, her counsel, and her ability to produce an heir, a role that was in its own way as sacred and as vital as the king's. Horemheb listened, his mind working furiously. The beautiful fiction of the storytellers had been replaced with the stark, unvarnished truth of history. The throne was not a prize to be won by marriage. It was a sacred trust, passed from a father to his son. The royal Kai, the divine life force, was not a trinket to be transferred through the female line. It was a core spiritual component of the pharaoh's existence, passed down from the very first king. The great royal wife was an equal partner in the divine duty of rule, but she was a partner, not the source of the power. Her power was to produce the heir, to advise the king to manage the complex world of the royal harem, to be a symbol of divine grace and beauty. It was a position of immense power, but it was a power derived from her husband, the pharaoh, and her son, the future king. The high priest of Thoth placed a final instructive finger on the family tree. The pharaoh's power, he said, his voice firm and final, is not a matter of a woman's blood. It is a matter of a god's inheritance. You, my lord, will not marry to gain the throne. You will marry to secure its future. The throne is already yours, for it is written in the blood of your father. The royal Ka is already waiting for you to fill you and make you whole. Your wife will be your partner, a sacred vessel for the next king. But the power, the divine right, it comes from Ra, from Horus, and from your father. Never forget this. Horemheb looked at the family tree no longer as a list of dusty names, but as a map of his own destiny. The storyteller's fable was a comforting lie for the masses. The truth was a cold, hard, and beautiful reality. He was not a prince who had to marry to become a king. He was a king who would one day marry to secure the future of his eternal throne. He was a god, a living link to a line that stretched to the very beginning of time, and his power was a gift from a father who had been born a god and would die a god. The heiress theory was a romantic notion for a world that wished for a different reality. The true story of the pharaoh was a story of a single, unbroken line, a sacred patrilineal chain that had held the kingdom together for thousands of years. The evening sun, Ra, in his final journey, cast long purple shadows across the Nile. Khepri, the aged pharaoh, no longer the fiery young man of his coronation, sat in a quiet garden within the palace walls. The sounds of the day, the distant clang of hammers from the construction of his eternal tomb, the rhythmic chanting of priests, the faint buzz of life from the city beyond were a familiar symphony. For decades, he had lived a life that was both public and deeply profoundly solitary. He was a god on earth, a living embodiment of Horus, a title he had worn with both reverence and an unshakable sense of purpose. He had been a king, a general, a high priest, and an administrator. But above all, he had been a living testament to a single powerful idea that his legitimacy was not a matter of human consent, but of divine mandate. A truth that had to be constantly and meticulously reinforced through spectacle art and an endless stream of propaganda. He thought back to the day of his coronation, a magnificent, awe-inspiring blur of ritual and public performance. The private anointing in the inner sanctum where the royal Ka had entered him was the theological core of his kingship. This was the true spiritual first night of his reign, a terrifying and beautiful moment of personal transformation. It was the genesis of a god, but that sacred truth confined to the innermost circle of his priests was not enough. For the millions of people who lived and died in the shadow of the pyramids, for the distant farmers of the Delta, and the fierce herdsmen of the southern frontier, a god was an abstract concept. He had to be a visible, tangible, undeniable reality. This is where the political genius of the coronation came into play. The year-long process was a masterstroke of propaganda, a grand theatrical campaign designed to broadcast his divinity to every corner of the two lands. The unification of the two lands, where he had physically bound the papyrus and the lotus, was a powerful visual metaphor. It was not just a symbol of his rule, it was a living demonstration of it. The public saw a god-king, his hands holding the very life and unity of their nation. It was a simple, elegant piece of statecraft that spoke to the hearts and minds of a people who understood the power of symbols. The royal procession that had followed was not a parade. It was a moving temple, a physical manifestation of his rule. The people did not see Khepri, the man, on the gilded litter. They saw the living Horus, the son of Ra, and in seeing him, their faith in his divine mandate was renewed. The running of the walls of Memphis, a grueling act of physical endurance, was not just a test of his strength. It was a promise to his people. It showed them that his strength, like the sun, was a constant, unshakable force, a living testament to his continued ability to protect them. Every ritual, from the appearance of the king to the said festival, was a carefully orchestrated piece of propaganda, each one reinforcing the same central truth. His reign was a part of the cosmic order. It was not a political choice. It was a divine inevitability. The contrast between the grand public coronations and the private, unceremonious nature of the royal marriages reveals the dual nature of his rule. His marriage was not a sacred rite. It was a legal arrangement, a pragmatic act of dynastic and political expediency. The marriage to a local noblewoman was a simple contract, a matter of cohabitation. There were no public vows, no religious ceremonies. The pharaoh was already married to Egypt. His body was a sacred vessel for the royal Kai, and his purpose was to ensure the continuity of the divine bloodline. His first night as a husband was a quiet moment of duty, not a public celebration of love. The marriage of a foreign princess, like the one from the Mitanni kingdom, was a political anomaly, a grand ceremony to publicly anoint a treaty, not a union. The dowry was not a private gift. It was a public declaration of a diplomatic alliance. This stark difference between the public ceremonies and the private unions proves a fundamental truth. The pharaoh's life was not his own. His every action was a piece of a larger cosmic plan, and his personal relationships were simply a means to an end. The grand, magnificent public spectacles were not the only tools of his propaganda. The art of the kingdom was his silent, enduring voice. The walls of every temple, every tomb, every obelisk were a canvas for his divine story. The symbolic suckling of the king was a prime example of this. The reliefs and figurines placed in temples throughout the kingdom were not just decorative. They were a theological and political statement. The image of the powerful adult king seated in the lap of a goddess was a constant visual reminder to a largely illiterate populace that their pharaoh was not a mere mortal ruler. He was the divine son, nurtured and protected by the gods themselves. This was the ultimate rebuttal to any whisper of political dissent. How could a man challenge a ruler who was suckled on the milk of a goddess? The colossi, the monumental statues of the pharaoh that towered over the landscape, were not just sculptures. They were living, breathing extensions of his divine presence. They stared out at the passing river traffic, their faces serene and powerful, a silent, unwavering testament to his authority. Every traveler, every merchant, every farmer who saw these towering figures was reminded that the pharaoh was the living bridge between heaven and earth. The temples themselves were not just places of worship. They were grand, magnificent statements of royal power, each stone a testament to his piety and his ability to command immense resources. The pharaoh's life was a work of art, a living monument to his divine right. The Eris theory, the romantic fable of the storytellers, was a perfect example of how the people in their need for a human story had created a beautiful fiction. The reality, as recorded in the dusty genealogies and administrative documents, was far more pragmatic. The succession was patrilineal, a sacred, unbroken chain from father to son. The great royal wife was not the source of the divine power. She was the sacred vessel, the partner, the counselor, the manager of the harem, and the mother of the heir. Her power was immense, but it was a power derived from her relationship to her husband and her ability to ensure the continuity of the divine bloodline. She was an equal in purpose, but a secondary source of authority. This was a truth that was too complex for the populace to grasp, so they created a simpler, more beautiful lie. As Khepri sat in his garden, the weight of his years on him like a comfortable robe, he felt a profound sense of peace. He had lived his life as a king, a god, and a man who understood the profound, intricate dance between power and propaganda. His entire existence had been a masterclass in the art of rule. His lavish public coronations had made him a king to the world, and his private marriages had secured the future of his dynasty. He had not ruled with an iron fist alone. He had ruled with a careful, meticulous blend of divine authority and masterful performance. His life was a testament to the fact that in ancient Egypt, the pharaoh was not a leader who ruled. He was the living, breathing essence of a kingdom, a god on earth, whose life was an eternal, magnificent, and unceasing act of sacred theater. His was a rule not just of laws, but of faith, a faith he had spent his entire life cultivating, one grand spectacle and one silent statue at a time. His reign, a synthesis of power and propaganda, was a living testament to the fact that in ancient Egypt the pharaoh was not just a man who ruled, he was the rule itself.